Welcome to Season 3, Episode 7 of the Database Podcast. I'm Dr. Molly Stewart, the Director of Research and Analytics Services at Education Analytics, and I'm joined today by my co-host, Vice President of Interoperability Solutions, Rosh Dhanawade. We work with school districts on interoperability and data quality using the EdFi data standard. And through this work, we have come to realize that there are at least 3 different languages being spoken by people working in this space: the language of databases and code, the language of teaching, learning, and educational leadership, and the language of research, including data science and statistics. This podcast aims to bridge the gaps among these 3 general areas, because the more we understand how each group conceptualizes data-related topics, the more progress we can make towards solutions for educators and students that fully take advantage of best practices and cutting-edge knowledge in each of these fields of work. And I will turn it over to Rosh to welcome our guests and start off the questions.
Hi, everybody. Today we're welcoming Eric Hilfer, who's the Chief Technology Officer at 1EdTech. EA has just recently started to engage and work with various 1EdTech standards, and through that we've come to know Eric. Part of today's podcast is really to introduce our audience to the wide range of interoperability standards that exist, and there are a number of them that are housed within 1EdTech. And so having Eric on is going to give us an entry point there. So Eric, thank you for joining us this morning, and thanks for spending time with us. Why don't we just go straight into your background? It's always interesting with our guests to know where people are coming from, because we've had so many varied guests with lots of varied backgrounds, and we all end up in education and have had a slightly different path there. So it's helpful for our audience that are either thinking of entering our fields or are already in our field to know that they're not alone in where they're originating from.
Great. It's great to be here. Thank you for the warm introduction. I think that my background is very exemplary of that kind of fusion of interest that Molly mentioned in the introduction. I was originally a research scientist, and at some point had a strong sense of needing to do something that was mission driven, that would really be supportive of children and adults who were learning. And so I did a pivot from grad school and went directly into teaching special ed. And from that background, uh, I had the great fortune to have my first teaching gig was at a small private school for learning disabilities that built its own software. And this was back before there really was an EdTech sector in technology. So they were incredibly innovative, both in how they structured their pedagogy and worked with students, and in their use of technology tools. So coming from, physics and engineering research, I was able to do a lot of coding over the nights, and then every day we were testing software with the kids and getting feedback from the students as they were learning, and then doing quick agile iterations, adapting, adjusting, and then trying again the next day. And through that process, I was completely hooked on the incredible impact that that technology could bring into education as a teaching enabler, like a force multiplier for educators, and really a set of tools for agencies for the learners themselves. So from there, my career branched because there really weren't EdTech jobs yet. You had to sort of create the field as you went. So I had a kind of dual career. When I couldn't get an EdTech job, I was working in aerospace and computer-aided design and some kind of big industrial and scientific computing applications. And I was able to bring a lot of the rigor from those settings into educational publishing. So when I eventually, through an acquisition, landed in Scholastic and had a long, like 15-year run with Scholastic, I was able to institute a lot of more, kind of standard industry practices in software engineering and data analysis and research into the educational publishing field, where a lot of things were being done in a pretty ad hoc way. From there, I moved on and have had leadership roles at Rosetta Stone, Pearson Virtual Learning, FEV Tutor, and eventually at the beginning of this year, I started as CTO at 1EdTech. 1EdTech's a really great organization, a nonprofit, and I had been aware of their work since I had worked for so long in K-12, like educational experience engineering and application development, where the emerging standards were very important to that work. And so I was familiar with EdTech work, but now on the inside, it's incredible, really, the amount of the detail that goes behind it.
Yeah, so you've had a chance to see lots of waves and shifts in the ed tech space. I wonder, in reflecting on your career and your engagement in this domain, like how many things that you see today in terms of emergent technologies are not the same, because technology changes all the time, but what do you see as like recurring themes that have just not gone away as it relates to 1EdTech and effective delivery of those technologies into classrooms? Like, do you see any persisting themes that have always been there that just continue to present themselves as either challenges, or you're seeing people take them on and do better work with those challenges?
I think there are repetitive cycles, and because of that feeling of deja vu, especially as a new technology appears, AI is the one today, and I think AI is probably the most profound revolution that we're facing, not just in education, but anywhere where technology is being used. But there are similarities. We harken back to when calculators were first introduced, and there were teachers picketing against them, and it seemed silly because calculators felt inevitable. However, there was a point to why teachers were protesting, because if you introduce calculators before students have number sense and kind of computational instincts, they miss a chance to actually learn about the meaning behind the numbers, and they go straight to using the tools. Ultimately, yeah, most of us do use calculators rather than doing long division by hand, but there needs to be some care into how they're introduced, and I think the same is true, but even more so in terms of using AI tools. And I think we really don't know a lot yet about the impact of this current revolution. However, education has always lagged behind other sectors in the effective use of technology. And some of that is for a reason, because it's heavily regulated, because what we put into children's minds is actually very important, that we think about that and actually understand something about the implications. But there are also kind of entrenched practices and things within education that would be nice if there was more support for flexibility. So, there's no single answer to your question, but I think that we can learn a lot from the past and what has led to successful adoptions of new innovation. And I think one of the biggest issues to tackle is there was this kind of joke about if the space program had reacted to setbacks the way education does, they would have tried a rocket. The first experiments would have failed, so they would have ditched the idea of rockets and they would have gone to rubber bands for a while and tried to launch things with slingshots. And when that didn't work, they'd go back to rockets. So, the point being that in education, there's there can be a lack of scientific follow through. The practice itself is actually pretty politicized. So it's kind of big camps. I mean, there was well-known wars between whole language versus phonics, and the answer was kind of obvious to any educator that for some learners, whole language worked great. For those that didn't immediately apprehend, being able to do sight recognition of words, for example, it was important to have a structured phonics approach. And so, usually a blend of practices is the right answer. And somehow education seems to be resistant to moderation or, varied application of things. So, as much as we can as practitioners in this space and as leaders, when we can advocate for nuanced approaches, combinations of approaches, looking for best fits, emulating best practices, human involvement, even with AI, the role of the teacher is more important, if anything. So it's not a question of are we going to replace teachers with AI? It's more about how can AI be used as a to strengthen the educational system and elevate the role of teacher as curator of what is going on, and teacher as coach rather than teacher as being the sole method of instructional delivery, for example. And then the other side of the equation, where I think a lot of we work together between 1EdTech and Ed Analytics and other bodies, is how do we make the data actionable? Feedback cycles from immediate feedback to the student, from directional feedback that goes to educators to help adapt what the student's trajectory will be, for career planning and lifelong learning pathways for the students, and for research and practice improvement, which is kind of that longest cycle of feedback. We have all the data. We've had the data for a long time. Even have the data faster and more accurate now. And still, there are many barriers to the successful connection of those feedback loops. And that's where we're hoping that standardization is part of the answer. But it's also about attitude and practice and regulation, and what we can do to ease the secure transmission of data with clear ownership and custody and protections without that being an obstacle to data sharing.
Yeah, you've given us like a real great transition into talking about 1EdTech and its role for the concepts that you just mentioned. Would you mind just talking to us a little bit about what 1EdTech's mission is currently, and as it relates to technology, what is the stance that 1EdTech takes as it relates to either creating technology or guiding technology? This role that 1EdTech is taking on in this ecosystem is super important, and I think it's sometimes hard from the outside, even if you've interacted. Like my first interaction with 1EdTech technologies, or back then as IMS Global, was using LTI, and we had Canvas in at Indiana University, and then we had a course evaluation software, and we were using LTI to launch into that course evaluation software. And I didn't even know that LTI was like a governed standard. I thought it was just like a technology tool from Canvas, right? So I think it's important that our audience understands what role does 1EdTech play in creating these standards, curating them, and then also the practices surrounding them. I think that's like another thing that I've come to appreciate over the last year and a half is not just the standards themselves, but the community of practice that surrounds it. So it'd be great if you could just give us a quick introduction to 1EdTech and then walk us through the current activities of 1EdTech.
Sure, that's great. As you mentioned, 1EdTech as an organization was originally named IMS Global. I can't even remember why, but it was conceived of as a standards organization or standards body, similar to the IEEE, which is a much more general engineering standards body. At its inception, IMS Global was looking for solving interoperability problems, like the essential market forces really created a situation where, I'm thinking of the work we did at Scholastic. We developed a suite that was anchored around an intervention product for literacy called Read 180, which was highly successful, had high production values, had a lot of data and instrumentation, and it had, adaptive learning and leveled reading with really high quality video, high interest videos. So basically a delayed reader, someone who may be 16 or 17 years old, but still reading at a third grade level, could interact with content and text that was leveled for their reading level, but was the appropriate content and interest subject matter for their age level. And very quickly, kids were catching up by using it. It was like well-proven resource, incredibly effective for mainstream as well as for remediation. And so why wasn't that everywhere? It was successful within Scholastic as a product. It actually had for an EdTech product, it's incredible. It had over $1 billion in lifetime revenue over about a decade of operation, reaching millions of students. But by its nature, because of it, it was a very fine-tuned solution. It was pretty closed. It was pretty locked into the management tools and the LMS and things within Scholastic. And it's not just the market forces of these publishers, wanting to kind of lock lock people into their platforms, there really wasn't any way to integrate the experiences with other experiences or to make the data more portable. And that's where standards really entered. Rosh, you mentioned LTI. That's probably one of OneEdTech's most well-known and well-adopted standards. It's a mechanism for launching applications from an LMS, but it really goes further. It's really about integrating learning experiences and sending educational context into those experiences. So the LTI launch can come with quite a bit of useful data. And I remember looking at it early on in my career and thinking, this doesn't have a chance of succeeding. They can't possibly understand the nuance of this and that. And, over time, it matured into something that was really usable. And as a result, it's pretty much the de facto method of integrating learning experiences into LMSs. And we estimate now that there are probably over about 10 billion launches of via LTI of learning experiences happening each year. And so it's an incredible success story, not just for us as a standards organization, but really the success is for the market and for the educational providers and the institutions and students and teachers that have a method now of bringing together different educational solutions from different providers and crafting them into something that's usable. So OneEdTech at a glance, we operate globally. We're represented by members in 36 countries. We have about 9,500, almost 10,000 members now, ranging from K-12 districts where there's about 600, post-secondary and workforce 140. We've got service providers and technology providers, about 500 of those. And the number of higher education learners we serve globally is about 20 million. K-12 learners, it's over 50 million. We have more than 9,000 products in our product directory that have some level of certification or vetting. We do about 1,500 certifications annually, and these certifications are generally around the adoption of an implementation of particular standards like LTI or OneRoster, which is another well-known standard that we curate. We host 5 conferences a year, Learning Impact in the US, in Europe, in Asia and Pacific. We have a Digital Credentials Summit, and we have a member assembly each fall. And we deliver a lot of webinars, over 250 a year on standards and interoperability related topics. So I think our strength is we are really a neutral party that is well positioned to convene strong directional conversations between institutions, providers, and directly to learners. So by having these folks all at the same table, including government entities and other nonprofits, we can convene working groups who are the ones who really actually author the standards. We're really curators. We don't make up the standards ourselves, although we do look for ideas directionally and try to convene conversations around emerging technology or new areas of interest that become relevant. And through that process, we actually publish detailed specifications. And then we build a robust ecosystem around the specifications themselves that includes reference implementations, automated test harnesses for doing diagnostics on an implementation of a standard. That data can be seamlessly piped in for a certification, like a conformance score based on which of the services within a specification have been implemented. And then that certification is essentially a badge or a credential that can associate a product or a consuming institution that might be consuming a specification. And that becomes like a symbol of interoperability. And then beyond the specifications themselves, we also do vetting of applications and implementations with rubrics around data privacy or accessibility that have been also community developed through this working group process. and then the vettings themselves are useful. Like in procurement, you can look at a set of products and you can say, okay, which standards do they adopt? How compliant are they with the requirements of our institution's privacy policy on adopting products? And then you can go beyond those vettings themselves and get an actual more in-depth certification that involves a deeper, search into data privacy and security posture of the product and the company that produces it. So we're really trying to be there to be a clearinghouse of information and also a forward-looking um, uh, organization that brings people together for experimentation and discovery.
You mentioned members. Why do these different organizations become members of OneEdTech? What is the benefit of being a member versus just a beneficiary of a vendor that's adopted one of the OneEdTech standards?
I think the biggest member benefit, which often is not the first one people go through, but I think ultimately the biggest member benefit is being at the table and uh, you know not just being able to listen in on important conversations that are happening across the sector, but also to bring leadership because every institution has something important to share. Every provider and supplier has some important insight into where their roadmaps are going, and it's really great if the providers can hear about how the institution's needs are evolving so that they can adapt their roadmaps to that, and vice versa. The institutions can get much more of a sense of, like, pragmatically what types of solutions are out there, how reliable are they, how secure are they, and how can we work together in terms of moving the whole industry toward more seamless interoperability. Everybody really wants to continue to have the incentives that help companies to innovate, but they also want the results to be interoperable in a way that further actually drives volume into those businesses. We want a really thriving and vibrant ecosystem that has a lot of interesting solutions in it, and we want those to work together. And I think what we're really helping to do is align those market forces. And so the primary, I think the ultimate member benefit is that these conversations are happening, and institutions, for example, are really able to uh, understand how to become a market force, how to pull together and say, we really want to make sure that the applications we adopt are able to be launched via LTI. It's like one thing. And so that becomes a procurement requirement. It becomes easy to see who has adopted it. And then the provider members, they get really a fast path to being able to implement their side of those standards. So as members, they get additional help and resources and community involvement, and so it's just a win-win combination where having these members from different parts of the ecosystem working together is the results are much greater than the sum of the parts.
That that community building and that uh, you didn't use this word, but I'll use it. Say the leveling of the playing field between multinational, multi-million billion dollar vendor and rural school district that is participating in one EdTech as a member, and having them both be in the same room, it is quite a powerful effect to and be there in person and observe that interaction where you have either a product manager or a vertical lead responding directly to a district and engaging at like a very practical level. So I'll echo what you said and just kind of plus that up because it has been a unique experience to be able to look and see how willing the members are to just engage and not really worry about where like who they represent or where they're coming from. They're there to curate these tools together for the benefit of learners. And you can really get that sense from the Learning Impact Conference that I've attended personally. And then even some of the work group interactions that you see online or in the webinars that are put on. So definitely want to echo that and say that that's not just the party line coming from Eric, but it's actually something that is seen by membership and even those that are new to the community, like we are here at EA. As it relates to the global footprint of 1EdTech, that's another thing I wanted to pick your brain on is how how does that interplay work? I mean, the cultural differences that you all are navigating as you try and say, okay, here's a OneRoster spec for North America, here's a OneRoster spec for Europe, or profile. I should be more accurate with my wording. How does your staff like navigate those waters? And do you do that by just having folks that are stationed there in different parts of the world, or are most of the staff here? Like, logistically, how do you pull that off?
It's difficult, I'd say, for an organization of our small size to do that. But it's very exhilarating. And I think, also what you mentioned earlier about, bring various people to the table, even in different parts or sectors within the educational ecosystem and different regions around the world, we are all very much united by an incredibly passionate sense of mission toward education. And so, like you said, you can have the CEO of, one of these enormous, ed tech providers sitting at the same table as the principal of, a rural school district in the U.S. And they're really on equal footing, and they're speaking the same language, and they're passionate about the same things, and that's pretty incredible. And that's, I think, what has kept me working in ed tech is that it's this amazing intersection of innovation, technology. I'm an engineer kind of by trade, so I get to um, I get to geek out on how these things can work together, but ultimately united by that very human mission of, the delight that a child feels when they're actually learning and the ability to own their learning experience and be able to take the results with them. So when we work in Europe, for example, we do have a few of our staff in Europe, and so, they are mostly architects, but they double as our ambassadors and representatives. They're in the deep conversations at the national level across Europe, and also, getting on planes and heading to Japan and Korea and other places where we have developing partnerships. So, the good news is the underlying standards are well designed to really do um, the essential things that need to happen in any of these regions. Where we need to go, like you mentioned, we do have a profiling process so that if there needs to be a regional adjustment, rather than have that being done by ungoverned extensions, which also can work. If you like Ed5 spec, for example, has a mechanism by which extensions can be added, and there's not a super heavy governance process associated with that. It does potentially limit the interoperability because it's hard to point to one definition of, what's the core stuff you can count on everywhere. And we try to thread that needle by we having these profiles that are added to our specifications. So we have like a French profile on OneRoster that has some particular additions to it. So it refers to the base specification for OneRoster, and then it spells out, some additional fields that might be in play because, the educational taxonomy is different from country to country, and you need to account for that. But we do it in a standardized way, and it goes through the same spec approval process, but it's just a little bit more lightweight and quick, and would have constituents from that region mostly weighing in on the design of that. And then it can also introduce new services, like there are, you know, uh, in Europe, there are country-specific notions of what you need for groupings of students. So, we have a profile that has some grouping specifications. Same thing for attendance and absenteeism, things like that. So we try to keep those things to be small in number and well enough defined that once they're in place, that country can operate. They have the base spec, they have their regional profile, and because we use a domain-specific knowledge to capture all this information in detail in a machine-readable format, we can automatically build just generate the documentation and the conformance testing and the certification processes from that definition, and we don't have to custom code that for the most part.
Well, since you mentioned EdFi, let's talk about EdFi and how we've kind of started to collaborate more as two communities that are really invested in the same end result. Is how do we make the experience of a student moving through early ed, secondary education, post-secondary education? How do we smooth the flows of data to their educators and people that make decisions within those education systems? So I think the core mission is the same, but we've had recently an announcement of a partnership, I think just almost about a year ago now, between 1EdTech and EdFi. What are the potential benefits, and then what have you seen over the last year as like the practical results of that partnership that are making its way into the marketplace right now?
That partnership to me is one of the most delightful things, and it really in my opinion, it points to the future of how standards continue to be vibrant and relevant, and even more practical and easy to adopt than they are today. One of the features of an organization like EdFi is they are standards based. They have their own definitions and formats and standards for what an EdFi stack looks like and EdFi data definitions. They are tailored for US K-12, so they have a specific uh, topic and area to address. And they are fairly comprehensive. I mean, there's a lot of really good information down to, discipline and behavioral logging and, a lot of the aspects you could think of operating in K-12 education. What they also have is they are not just a specification about that definition of data. They are actually a design for running software, and they actually have buildable software and packageable, like containerized versions of things. So there's a system associated with it. So it's not just theory; it's practice, and that eases adoption. And then even beyond that, they have an ecosystem and a network of service providers that can implement and tune those types of adoptions. So Ed Analytics is a great example of one of those. And so when I look at our standards, I feel like the path to actually helping students is to actually get them implemented. And One EdTech doesn't really build software to be running out at the institutions. There are a few exceptions to that, but generally our job is convening and designing around the standards and the specifications. So I think partnering with organizations like EdFi, and there are others out there that actually go through the full stack down to implementation services, I think that's brilliant because when we kind of organized the community, EdFi also is a member-driven organization, so it was very easy to bring together One EdTech members, EdFi members. There was already an overlap of that Venn diagram, and bring folks together and say what would be the first thing that we need to get done. They all said OneRoster is what we need to express our student lists in. That's the format that's already widely industry adopted. That's a One EdTech standard. EdFi had an API for rostering. It wasn't widely adopted because it was another, just different. So we said, why not have EdFi be able to express its rosters using OneRoster? And so we engaged in that, and a year later, we're close to releasing that solution as part of the EdFi distribution. And I think that's incredibly powerful because now it puts OneRoster, which is what people want to consume when they hook things into EdFi, right at the source of the data alongside EdFi. And I see it as the first of many specifications that we may be able to integrate. And it also points to that, ability to further harmonize the way rosters are used because now all of these many EdFi distributions that are out there are OneRoster ready. So now the OneRoster specification is even more useful because it'll be in more places where it wasn't. And so I'm just looking for opportunities across the board where there are other organizations doing other standards aligned things, and especially the pragmatic things that are already locked into implementations. And then how do we make those standards even more portable by harmonizing how they work with other existing standards that are out there?
What are the like for that work, how are community members getting engaged that work? I know we personally at EA did a small project to like build a proof of concept and basically have a code start to what this looks like in the field. But if folks want to just be involved in the, just like you mentioned, people get involved in the curation of the LTI spec and OneRoster. This is also one of those things where it's not necessarily just the technology portion. It's also, how do you reconcile two standards that are very similar in the data that they're collecting for the same use case, in this case, rostering with OneRoster, but the expressions of that data look different enough that you need somebody or a group of somebodies to really say, here's what the matches are, because you can have one technical group make that decision, but I think the power here is the fact that you have lots of different users of both of these standards out in the marketplace that could weigh in. What are the entry points for folks to be able to join that conversation, if any, right now?
We do have a joint project page on the OneEdTech website. You can find it just by Googling OneEdTech and EdFi, ed-fi, FI. And that gives you a whole bunch of resources. And there are many ways to weigh in. We also have a rostering steering committee that is comprised of members who have done rostering implementations. Part of the good news is we're not inventing this whole idea from scratch. There have been several strong examples of having institutions or providers have already integrated OneRoster with EdFi for different, specific purposes and using different techniques. So building on that, a lot of those questions of data matching and uh, what needs to be transferred and what doesn't, and what the kind of crosswalk between the two definitions. A lot of that have some really good examples that we've been building from. So anyone who wants to be involved can certainly go to that website. There's a roadmap there, so you can keep tabs on where we are in the process of the OneRoster integration and what ideas we're considering next in terms of interoperability between EdFi and other standards. And then there are opportunities at EdFi's EdFi Alliance Summit that's coming up in a few weeks. Then the OneEdTech member assembly in November is another opportunity. We also have frequent webinars. You can watch the old ones if you go to that website and find them and sign up for next ones. So there's a lot of places. It's great, for what seems like a pretty esoteric and specific topic. It's exciting to have, over 125 people show up for a webinar to track our progress and to ask questions about what's next. And the feedback we get is amazing in terms of the detail. We learn a lot from the attendees, and that's really the whole point. So getting involved in any of those ways is super helpful to us, and I think also provides value to everyone who shows up.
So we've gone like pretty practical here in the last couple of questions. So time to get more into the philosophical, and I know that um, I've heard you speak on these things, so I don't think these will catch you offside. So, um, given what you mentioned at the very top of this call with the emergence of AI, um, what is One EdTech doing in that space to address some of the challenges that you mentioned as it relates to the incursion? So a lot of a lot of education technology providers are implementing some type of AI technology within their offerings. It's either big features or small features. It is already entering into the marketplace and is already making its way into classrooms and school districts. What role does One EdTech see themselves playing as it relates to this advent? And what are the ways in which One EdTech is actually taking action as it relates to putting the right guardrails and practices around the use of AI within education?
We do a lot, and so we try to cover the spectrum of things that need to happen here. And a lot of it is about awareness and information sharing. So probably one of the most important things we do is we have built and continue to evolve with community input a rubric that, like the data privacy or accessibility rubrics, gives you a fingerprint of how AI is being used within a particular solution. That can be really helpful because it's standardized, it's well informed, so it's not just a kind of surface reading, but it involves really getting in deep with the provider about where is AI present in the product, what purpose is it serving, how is the model trained, how what is secured, where is the information, like student information and student performance information, going. Is that training a model somewhere? So you can imagine all the different aspects to it that are not transparent otherwise. So I think we're doing an important service in bringing together um, that kind of definition of the AI fingerprint in something, and ability for people to sign on and disclose that information in a way that, like a institutional procurement, they can go through and kind of survey the applications they're using or that they want to use, and they can get that reading in a standardized format. So that's kind of the minimum entry level that I think is super important. But I think where the real action is around we have a kind of new sub-organization within our company that is called Learning Impact Labs, and it's really a chance to convene researchers, learning scientists, providers, institutions, government entities, educators, in the constructing of, what is the actual intent and the promise around AI integration? Because it's incredible. We can all probably in a minute imagine, some really amazing ideas of how AI can help in making sense out of data, in guiding learning experience, in constructing learning experiences, in, kind of new generations of how we assess achievement. It potentially supercharges everything, or it potentially undermines everything if you don't know how it's working. So we actually have a series of experiments that are being organized right now with some of the big AI providers, institutions, and curriculum providers around how does agentic AI um, connect into educational data in a meaningful way that preserves the intent and integrity of the educational experience, while also making the data more actionable and the experiences more customizable. And so just having all those folks at the same table so that the providers, especially the AI providers who maybe don't have, you know, right now their mission is to try to get those agents going everywhere, to do good, but also to, promote their brand, et cetera. They are very interested in having that actually be legitimately educational and, fulfill the mission of the educators behind it. And so, uh, one nuance to that is you can look at, standards are there to sort of express the details and the structure of education and data. And you could take the attitude, well, let's just let the AI model figure that out rather than be so prescriptive. And that could work. It would be hard to tell if it did work or if it's working the way you expected. But there's something very interesting about the AI models. In some ways, they are similar to how we function. And one of the insights we've been dealing with is, if you give the model the job of actually structuring what's coming in, as well as drawing conclusions and making recommendations and finding matches, et cetera, that actually introduces the equivalent of cognitive load into the model. For those of us who are educators, we're always thinking about, we don't want our students counting on their fingers when they multiply when they're older, because that's going to take all of their working memory and put so much cognitive load on. They're not going to do any higher order thinking beyond that. You want them to have fluency on their math facts so that they can actually use their brain for the important things, important aspects of thinking. So it's the same thing with these models. They need context. The Model Context Protocol, MCP, from Anthropic, is really now the de facto point of integration between those models and our systems. If we can give the MCP endpoints well-structured, standards-based descriptions of educational context that we know are portable and have similar meaning in differing systems, then we can take all that load out of the models themselves and use the models for the more deeper educational insights and grouping and pattern recognition and other things that is our real intent, rather than overloading them with figuring out, okay, what does course mean over here? In Norway, a course is this thing. In this other thing, it means another thing. I mean, it could just go down a rabbit hole, even just figuring out what the words mean. And so that's why I think there's actually an even more important use for standards for AI consumption, even more so than for human consumption, in terms of being able to rationalize that context across all the different points that we want to connect together. AI, in a way, is an excuse to want to connect stuff together. We should make it meaningful, and I think we have a lot of work to do in standardizing some of that meaning that's going in. And, like in agile mentality, we want to do just enough of that. We don't want to overthink it and constrain the solution. But we want to give them a good basis set to work with so that the models aren't arguing over the kind of semantics and the meaning of the data when it's quite obvious to us what it is.
Well, Eric, I think that's most of my questions. I think Molly has a question to like kind of bring us home on the practical front. But from my perspective, thank you for being so open and sharing so much today. It's been super helpful for me as well to one get some echoing of thoughts that I've already had in my head, but also just to see your perspective on things. But Molly?
Yeah, so this is going to be a really basic question because I am new to the rostering kind of part of this world. And this is also a question for Rosh. EA and 1EdTech have a common work stream, and I was wondering if one or both of you could kind of describe what that actually looks like in practice. What are the tech folks here actually doing to make these standards compatible, or um, you know, to make them both be able to be used by EdFi users? If that question even makes sense.
It does, yeah.
Okay.
Raj, I can do a first pass and maybe
Yeah, go for
you
it.
can
Go for it.
fill in some of the details. I think what we have here is like I said before, making these standards, taking them from theory into practice is the whole point. And I think a company like Ed Analytics is perfectly positioned to do that. You're working with a consortium of states on some large data projects, so you represent a fair amount of diversity of solutions, but with common purpose that can actually make a collective decision. And guiding the use of OneRoster and potentially other standards in that space based on EdFi installations, I think is incredibly powerful. And it opens up that whole ecosystem to be highly connectable to other solutions in a way that's predictable and empowering. And Raush, maybe you could provide a little more
Yeah,
nuance
absolutely.
on how that is. Yeah.
For our technical folks, one of the things that we were looking to produce was uh, like a minimally invasive solution here. One that somebody that already has a EdFi implementation could pick up, drop into their existing environment, and then run with little disruption to the regular operations of the EdFi API. And so our initial design was to create a set of views that live alongside the EdFi tables that are the marriage of OneRoster and EdFi designations for the same things. And in some cases, some transformations were necessary, because the way in which OneRoster expresses a particular concept is either an amalgamation of multiple EdFi things or vice versa. And so we've crystallized all of those in a set of views that I believe are in an open source repository that folks can look at. And then we created just a thin API that lives outside of the EdFi API. Again, this was for a proof of concept mainly, is to show that one, you could do the arrangement of data correctly, correctly enough that you could pass the conformance testing that Eric mentioned at the top of the call. And then also provide a way to enumerate what are the remaining challenges to basically bring that thin API and its endpoints into the core EdFi API and make that available so that folks wouldn't need to administrate two different API surfaces. So that's really the next phase of work, is to say, how do we leverage what EdFi already offers in terms of the admin and security model, and then correlate that with the way in which OneRoster handles its own security model, and then make sure that we have from the same interface the ability to express both the OneRoster views and the regular EdFi endpoints. And so we're probably about 80% of the way there, and we had a lot of good conversations in that work stream that we did about what the next steps would look like. I think the work that we did was mostly all in Postgres, and so there's going to be a conversion that's necessary to take those Postgres views and convert them into equivalent delivery within Microsoft SQL Server. But I think going back to the AI conversation, that is a task that is like a little bit easier to do nowadays, because the cognitive load of like, what are all the features that are in SQL Server that are not in Postgres and vice versa, and how do I account for them is a little bit more straightforward nowadays, and you don't have to browse through a bunch of technical documentation. I mean, it's always, I'm not saying don't do it, always verify your work, but that is the remainder of the work that needs to be done, is basically the final bringing in of the OneRoster endpoints into the EdFi surface, and then being able to deploy this regardless of database engine that you're using for EdFi. And the conceptual mapping, though, is the same regardless of the database engine. And then also, if you're listening to this and you're like, well, what about what happens when those table structures go away in DMS? Well, the conceptual mapping still stands, and we just kind of transition into now going up against the JSON structures instead of the table structures to do that same conceptual mapping. And in some ways it might be easier, some ways it might be more challenging, but that is like the horizon work that's left in front of us. But I believe the work that we completed and handed off is in a public repository that the Alliance maintains currently. So I think that's something that might be shared at the summit. And then if you're interested, you can definitely follow up with any one of us on this call, and we'd be happy to get that out to you.
Yeah, it's exactly right. There's a public repo on for this project at EdFi, so you can probably find it by poking around there. But it's also linked from the resources on that project page I was talking about, and you can track the progress. And I think we are very well on track to having that really fully integrated, including the Microsoft SQL Server support in Q4 this year. So I consider this an awesome first project. It makes me very excited for what we do next.
Well, thanks, Eric, for your time. Any final thoughts or anything that you'd like to say to our audience before we sign off?
Yeah, I would, encourage people to get involved. Don't treat anything like it's in the educational ecosystem as if it's just kind of locked and fixed. With your involvement, things can change and improve, and we really do need that input. And one thing I've noted too, there are more than one standards organizations or organizations are putting out data formats or interoperability schemes. And, for a bunch of people who are so mission driven by getting things to work together, I've always been impressed at how poorly the standards organizations can interoperate. So I'm really, really dedicated to increasing the types of partnerships and collaborations we're talking about, like the one between EdFi and 1EdTech. I hope to see more of those so that we have a united front and a way of meeting all educators, so we don't get any data like stuck in a camp of one set of standards versus another. We really all could be working together and really should be, especially in a time of so much change, both in the political landscape and position of education, the emphasis of public funding, as well as the introduction of AI. Things are going to look very different in 5 years. And I think standards are a source of psychological safety and some persistence and ability to kind of know our landscape no matter what is going on outside. So they are worth investing in. And I hope to see more people seek memberships and participate in the whole process. And thanks again for the great opportunity to talk about these things here. I could talk all day, and really appreciate all of the work that Ed Analytics does in this space.